change team just a couple weeks ago. And I'll be handing in, Rob and I will be tag teaming the presentation. So I'll hand it off to him for now.
Bujuga kina wia Rob Indigenous Kaz going into Demasine, Philadelphia, and Dunjaba, Anishinaabe Aki, and GLIFWC Indanoki. My name is Rob Kroll. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Coming to you today from Odana, Wisconsin, where it was snowing this morning. I don't know what the weather's like down there in Stevens Point. So as Hannah said, we're going to talk to you this afternoon about Aanji-bimaadiziimagak Aki. And I wanted to say a little bit about that title before we start. The loose translation of that is the world is changing. But we know that it's really imprecise translating from Indigenous languages to English and back and forth. And I wanted to point out that word bimaadizi in the middle, which means life. And there are a couple other terms that we talk about a lot. One is Mina bimaadiziwen, or the good life. And that's the title of the artwork that you see on the left side of your screen. It's also the cover of our vulnerability assessment. This artwork was done for us by Sam Zimmerman, who's a member of the Grand Portage Band up in Minnesota. And in his explanation of this painting, he recognized that the woman in the canoe there really has everything she needs to have a good life. So wild rice and walleye, and the medicines represented in the sparks coming up from the fire, all the land, the plants, growing things, and the animals. Another term that follows along with this is Aanji-bimaadiziimagak, which can translate to from where we get life. And that's a term that was used in the treaty negotiations that I'll talk about in a little bit by some of the tribal leaders to describe the lands and waters that they were ceding to the United States, recognizing that this was the place where they and their descendants for the next 7 generations were going to need to have access to for them to have life and live in that good way. Go ahead, Hannah. So a little disclaimer here. This presentation contains traditional ecological knowledge that was shared with GLIFWC by Ojibwe tribal members under the principles of free, prior, informed consent. This knowledge is owned by the individual or their family and can be rescinded or withdrawn at any time. It does not belong to GLIFWC. We have audio clips in this presentation. They're shared with the permission of the speaker or their family. Permission for recording has not been given, so we'll be giving signals when we're about to do audio clips so that recording can be stopped, and then we'll tell you when to restart again. Next. So if you're not familiar with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLIFWC, we're an intertribal natural resource agency. We exercise authority delegated to us by our 11 Ojibwe member tribes to implement federal court orders and interjurisdictional agreements related to their treaty rights. We operate very similar to a state DNR, for example. So we have wildlife and fisheries management programs. We have conservation law enforcement officers. We have a public information office, Division of Intergovernmental Affairs, which is where I work, which are the folks who liaison with the other agencies and negotiate agreements. And really function in the same way, but it's completely related to the tribe's ability to maintain, preserve, and implement their off-reservation treaty rights. And we'll talk a little bit about treaty rights first, just to get kind of some background on GLIFWC and on how our climate change program fits in. Next. So on this map, you see the 4 areas of ceded territory. The 11 Ojibwe member tribes ceded land to the United States in these 4 different treaties in the mid-1800s, all of which contained very similar statements wherein tribal members reserved their rights to continue to access ceded land to hunt, fish, and gather and maintain their way of life And on the right side, you see an article from the 1837 treaty, which reflects this and really calls out wild rice, which is central to the culture. And we'll talk a lot more about wild rice in a minute. We want to recognize that these treaties weren't entered into because the tribes wanted to do that. Treaties were really signed under duress, but the tribes at the treaty negotiations really worked hard to make sure that they were able to maintain their way of life into the future for their descendants. Unfortunately, shortly after the treaty making period was concluded, the states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan came into being and immediately started regulating without considering treaty rights. And tribal members were cited, often jailed, for feeding their families off reservation. And this contributed to ongoing intergenerational trauma, along with things like the Dawes Act, which broke up the reservations, and boarding school, all of the things we've heard about that really were designed to separate Indigenous people from their culture. In the 20th century, treaty rights were reaffirmed by a series of court cases, interjurisdictional agreements. We'll talk a little bit here about the LCO versus Voigt in the state of Wisconsin case. It's the one that applies here in Wisconsin. In this case, tribal members were cited and brought into court for practicing their treaty rights off reservation. And the court eventually held that the tribes had the right to continue their way of life in all parts of the ceded territories, not just on their reservations. They had a right to virtually all the different kinds of natural resources and a max of 50% of harvestable resources. So an easy way to think about this is to think about the Wisconsin elk herd. Every year there's somewhere between 5 and 10 permits, recently anyway, that have been issued for hunting elk, and the tribes are entitled to 50% of those permits. Tribes have regulatory jurisdiction on and off reservation over their tribal members exercising their rights. So those regulations are enforced by GLIFWC conservation wardens. Tribal members are cited into tribal court if they violate. And because of tribal sovereignty, these are things that are not published in the paper. They're not required to be. They're not public information. But tribal regulations cover all variety of hunting and fishing, camping activities, and tribes are co-managers of ceded territory natural resources with the other sovereign governments, so the states and the federal governments. Next. Our GLIFWC climate change program was started in 2014 to use a holistic approach to look at climate change impacts, culturally important beings in the ceded territories, and to promote the recognition that the Anishinaabe knowledge and worldview provide important and needed contributions to the understanding of resource vulnerability and climate adaptation, recognizing that climate change is going to have a profound effect on treaty rights, especially if, as we'll talk about, culturally important beings move or are extirpated out of the ceded territories, which limits the tribal members' ability to continue to practice their rights. Next. Pat, you'll want to stop recording here. Go ahead, Hannah. So we talk a lot about traditional ecological knowledge in this presentation. This is a little word cloud that we did out of words that were used by tribal members to think about a definition that we gave them of TEK, which really includes more than just science. The words they gave us were beings and survival and culture and truth and change, observations, environment, stories, lifeways, and manadug, which are spirits. It's a full knowledge system, equal to science in its power, complementary, but sometimes it doesn't always agree. Next. And you're up, Hannah.
Okay, which brings us to our vulnerability assessment. Version 1 on the left there, we published in April 2018, and it had 11 beings in it. I know you have all read that cover to cover, so we won't need to talk about anything that's in there. But we can talk about our version 2 on the right there. That is now available at our website. Take note that the capital C's are necessary in that website. We do have some hard copies available. We're getting them printed, but we just have a limited amount of copies right now. So I think Pat has flash drives available for people that want the PDF, and know that we will have hard copies available for the public in the future.
I do have thumb drives, yes.
Great, thanks. So we're just going to give you a brief overview of this assessment, what it has in it, and you can look to the PDF for more info. Okay, so we chose 68 beings for our assessment. These are all beings of special cultural significance, or beings that were chosen based on a round of initial interviews we did with tribal members. So the ones that were mentioned the most or had special cultural significance were chosen on our list, with just a note that, you know, to Ojibwe people, all beings are considered important. So we tried to include some, and would have liked to include more. You might also notice that we're using the word being instead of species, and that's an attempt to use more culturally appropriate terms. We use the term beings to emphasize how all other non-human life forms are considered relatives. So in our assessment, we did try to integrate traditional ecological knowledge and scientific ecological knowledge. We'll use TEK and SEK as acronyms. And we know that both of those knowledge sources can contribute a lot to understanding why a being might be vulnerable to climate change. So we did our best to integrate both of those in our results. So what we tried to use the backbone of the assessment as knowledge we got from traditional ecological knowledge interviews. So we did, I think, 25 to 30 interviews in across the ceded territories in our member tribal communities with knowledge holders and elders, and hunters and gatherers that were willing to speak with us about climate change. The interviews were semi-directed, so we provided a list of questions, and interviewees could choose to either answer those questions or speak about whatever knowledge they wanted to share or whatever teachings they wanted to share. So we used knowledge from those interviews, and again, you'll hear some of the audio clips throughout the presentation. We also used a tool called the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. It's an Excel-based tool produced by NatureServe, and it's been pretty widely used to look at climate change vulnerability. It looks at all different aspects of a being's natural history, so you can pinpoint exactly how they might be vulnerable to climate change. So in this index tool, we were able to include scientific literature, journal articles, other studies like that, but we were also able to include information from the interviews in that index as well. So both of those are included in our results, and then we tried to use just a lot of quotes and knowledge straight from the tribal members in the assessment as well. So when you get a chance to read it, you'll see a lot of quotes and knowledge sprinkled throughout as much as we could. Okay, so then the Climate Change Vulnerability Index produced a ranking of all of the beings from lowest to highest, which ones might be the most and which ones might be the least vulnerable. So we'll go over that. So some of our results, first from the interviews. This is a word cloud we put together from all of the interviews. Without words like and or but or. So the larger the word appears, the more often it was mentioned, as you probably know. Ojibwe Mon is a verb-based language, so I think it's cool to see a lot of action words, a lot of verbs in there. The interviews covered, it's hard to tell from this word cloud, but the interviews covered not just climate change, but you know, observations from their family or other families from this generation or past generations, and all kinds of other things. Things like human degradation of the environment, cultural fire, the use of tobacco or assessme, lots of different cultural practices, spearing walleye, maple sugaring, all of those things came up. Things like the original treaty with all of creation, things like cultural suppression and treaty rights. So all of those things came up in these interviews. And, you know, while the words climate change might not have been used in every single interview, there are ties to, you know, pretty much everything that was discussed with climate change. And you can stop the recording here, Pat. So I'll just point out that this was just a teeny tiny fraction of all of the knowledge that was shared with us, which we're really grateful to all of the people that we interviewed for sharing. And so this knowledge is really deep knowledge. It's really many times rooted in very specific locations. So considered alongside other climate change studies and, you know, results from that climate change vulnerability index tool, that gives us more of an idea across the region how a being might be vulnerable. But hearing from tribal members in that place can really tell us a lot about very specific locations. And I like to talk about that strawberry example from Lac Vieux Desert, because, you know, strawberries came out in our assessment as not very vulnerable. And, you know, they mentioned that in June it's been too cold for strawberries there. So that's an example of one particular place where, you know, it might be different than across the region. So overall in our assessment, we looked at 5 categories commonly used by Ojibwe people: plants, crawlers, swimmers, four-leggeds, and flyers. And of those 5, plants and swimmers came out as the most vulnerable. That it's for quite a few reasons. One of the reasons that they have in common is that they those categories of beings can't disperse quite as far across the landscape, or as quickly anyway. Fish can definitely move around in the lake or in chains of lakes, but you know, have a harder time moving across the landscape, and same with plants. So one thing we heard from people when we did interviews, and lots of studies are looking at this, is that lakes with walleye or Ogaa that are suitable for walleye now might shift to be more suitable to ashigan or largemouth bass in the future. We heard, especially from a lot of people in the Bad River area, that walleye that they're catching are a lot smaller than they have been in the past, and that there are fewer of them. And I know that's true across a lot of northern Wisconsin as well. And so this study, we borrowed a graphic from Gretchen Hansen's work. And this is showing the probability of occurrence of walleye in green and largemouth bass in orange, related to degree days of a lake. So that's one metric of warming. So areas where it might be colder would be on the left. Areas where it might be a lot warmer would be on the right. So much more likely to have largemouth bass in those lakes. And then right around that 2400 or 2500 degree day switch, there's a big transition from Ogaa to ashigan. And a lot of the lakes in northern Wisconsin fall in that area where there's currently about 2400 growing degree days currently. But as it warms and that number increases, you can see that there could easily be a switch from more of an Ogaa dominated lake to ashigan. And I know that Ogaa are very popular with tribal members and to everybody really. So and if the Ceded Territories have a lot of Ogaa lakes now, and in the future, most of those lakes are dominated by largemouth bass, that's not something that treaty rights won't move with those fish. Another word cloud for you guys. This is the beings that were mentioned in the interviews. So we pulled out just the beings that were mentioned. Again, the bigger the word, the more often it was mentioned. So you can see walleye was one of the bigger ones, but the big three, rice, deer, and birch, talked about in almost every single interview that we did. And if we look at all of the beings, there were 10 that were classified as extremely vulnerable. Well, that's the highest category that we have. So Wabizashi, pine marten, or American marten, sorry, moose, self-explanatory, Mushkegowbog, Labrador tea, Manoomin is wild rice, Waboos, snowshoe hare, Inanandug, balsam fir, Mushkegowbog is tamarack, Adikameg is whitefish, Kijigatig, northern white cedar, and Odunabine is tullibee. So again, all northern beings, all beings that the Ojibwe people have developed relationships with over the past, over thousands of years, and all in danger of declining dramatically. So Manoomin, wild rice, was the most vulnerable being in the assessment. Every way Manoomin can be vulnerable to climate change, pretty much, it is vulnerable to climate change. So any human land use changes around water bodies, that can all impact Manoomin. Changes in water level, so either lower or higher water levels can affect Manoomin. They like a consistent water level throughout the year. It can vary from year to year, but throughout the year, if there's water level changes, that can hurt the rice plants. Storms, so the plant's pretty sensitive. It's really wind and hail can be really damaging to the rice beds, as well as flooding from those big storms can drown rice. We've had in 2012 and 2016, when we had those huge rain events, there were a lot of rice beds in the Ceded Territories that were wiped out for that year, and there wasn't a crop for people to harvest that year in certain areas. So other beings, Canada geese and swans have been noted to be favored by climate change and like to eat rice like the rest of us. So there have been quite a few instances, especially in the St. Louis River, where swans have been devastating rice beds, and there isn't anything for anyone else to harvest. Other beings, non-local beings like hybrid cattail, if with warmer conditions, they'll have more favorable conditions for them to grow, and can grow in areas that Manoomin might traditionally like to grow in. Especially warmer, more humid nights during the summer can promote a fungus called brown spot disease, which can affect the leaves of the plant. And that's been seen in increasing frequency in Ceded Territory lakes. Other land use changes, dams can impact wild rice beds as well. And snow and ice in the winter, Manoomin seeds require that long period of cold and ice in order to germinate in the spring. So Manoomin is getting impacts from every which way. And we've heard, I think every single interview mentioned Manoomin. And so here's just one audio clip talking about climate change impacts. So you can stop the recording. And so that was talking about these rice worms that you might know of if you harvest wild rice. That again, longer, warmer summers can give them better conditions to survive and get in the rice and damage it, and then cause impacts to the rice crop, like Fred mentioned. And now let's switch back over to Rob.
So another thing that we think about in our climate change program and that we asked the interviewees about were cultural indicators. And go ahead and throw that first question up, Hannah. So things like, what do you look for to know when it's time to start or stop harvesting certain things, such as spring peepers or thunderstorms, certain plants blooming? And then really another thing is how do you know how good or bad the harvest is going to be that year? Go ahead and throw that one up too. So different environmental cues that people used, and Carmen Butler described it a little bit in that very first audio clip that we heard. You know, since there wasn't a TV weatherman or radio or anything like that back in the old days, people knew when to do things by the different environmental cues. Go ahead to the next one. So one of those is when spring peepers start calling, which is right around now. It's time for walleye season. And in some places that's true. Other places they relate spring peepers to muskellunge, for example. So a lot of this is place-based. But for most of the ceded territory, this is one of those cues that's consistent but slowly beginning to change. Next. As soon as popple or aspen leaves are as big as quarters, or some say beaver ears, the suckers would run. And we know from tribal members that this relationship really started to change about 15 years ago, especially up here in the Bad River area. So we have one more audio clip, and we'll ask Pat to stop the recording one more time. That's really the end of our presentation, and we have one more slide here. I know a lot of folks that attend this convention are members of lake associations, live on lakes, really care about the lakes. And in some places, these are lakes that are harvested during the spring walleye spearing season. Things aren't as bad as they were back in the 1980s during what we call the walleye wars, where there were the huge demonstrations at the boat landings during and right after the court cases that reaffirmed the treaty rights. But tribal member harvesters are still being harassed even today. That harassment can be verbal, people hollering, cursing, racial slurs, threats, physical threats, vandalism of boats or vehicles, shining lights on harvesters or boats, any other actions that impede legal spearing activity, and setting off fireworks or even discharging firearms at or in the vicinity of harvesters. And all of these things have happened even recently in the past couple of years. So we're really asking you, if you're living or at a lake that has spearing activity happening and you witness this kind of behavior, please call 911 immediately. If you see this kind of behavior at boat landings or on the water, you're going to need to confirm your location, the location of the illegal activity, descriptions of people, vehicles, and boats. And if you have other information about a incident that happens, so it's something that's happening not in your presence, but you've heard about it, GLIFWC is collecting this information. We work with the DNR in the state of Wisconsin to update laws to protect tribal harvesters from harassment and intimidation when they're practicing their legal rights to hunt, fish, and gather off-reservation in the ceded territories. And next slide. And with that, we would like to say Miigwech, bizindawiyeg. Thank you for listening to us, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Well, Miigwech, Hannah and Rob, thank you very much. You know, GLIFWC has a lot going on right now this time of the year, and for you guys to take time out of your busy schedule to make time for us, we really appreciate it. I do have thumb drives with the two versions of the climate adaptation menu on thumb drives for you up here. So before you leave, folks here in the audience, please make sure you get a copy. I also want to let the Zoom folks know that we will make these 4 handouts available on the archive that is created as part of this conference. And perhaps, Rob, as I go to the first person here in the audience with the question, you could just mention the treaty rights documents. I added also the insert that's in the most recent newsletter to the handouts too. But if you could just mention those 2 documents a little bit on what they are, and I added those to the mix as well.
Sure. So the brochure and the other document that Pat mentioned really are really good explanations of what the treaty rights are, the fact that they are pre-existing use rights that predate even European settlement that the tribes always had. And that's what they reserved for themselves in the treaties when they ceded most of their land to the United States government, land that we all live on today. And one of the things that, one of those popular misconceptions is that treaties give tribal members special rights, and that's not true. These are rights that they've always had that they kept for themselves when they gave us the right to live here in those treaties. So I encourage people to read them, especially if you're not familiar with them or have heard, other versions of what treaties are and what those treaty rights are.
Hi, Rob. This is Katie Hine. And Hannah, I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm really excited to read the menu. I haven't gotten a chance to yet. I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more of some examples of adaptation and maybe how tribal members are thinking about adapting, and maybe specifically with some water species, like how much resistance versus kind of accepting the change, maybe with, for example, like the walleye to bass. If there's strategies where they're thinking more of resisting versus kind of accepting maybe a different fishery.
Yeah, there was actually a journal article that was done last year. Aaron Schultz from GLIFWC wrote that some of us helped with, that talked about the resist, accept, direct framework and walleye in particular. And walleye is one of those beings that is fairly central to Ojibwe culture. So the sentiment in that case is always going to be to resist change. Having said that, there are places where people are starting to target other species like bass because they recognize that fish is a very healthy food. Bass are going to become more abundant, and it'd definitely be beneficial to them to kind of diversify in the face of climate change. Though whether that's how individuals are thinking about it, I don't know. We see the tendency to want to resist for other beings too, like wild rice, most definitely. But people are interested in changes that could be happening in different species that could be finding their way north, and wanting to learn how to interact with them as well. And I don't know, Hannah, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add that I think a lot of the conversations we have, there's a lot of research out there talking about moving species very far north and doing all kinds of manipulations. And I think in general, we have a lot of conversations with people in our member tribes that there's still a lot to learn from the beings that are out there. And maybe they won't respond to climate change in the way that we are thinking. Models are only so good. So I think, yeah, in general, a lot of resistance and wanting to just watch and learn from the beings out there.
Rob and Hannah, this is Pat again. One of the things I loved about the 1.0 version was there's some really beautiful language and description about that kinship relationship you've been talking about. And I would just encourage folks, if they're interested in exploring that more, the first guide does a wonderful job of sharing that theme and point of view. Any other questions here in the audience?
This is more just a curiosity that I've had in my work on the Lake Lucerne or Stone Lake fish tank project. There's been a lot of controversy about walleyes, and what I had learned was there weren't a lot more walleyes on inland lakes until about the 20s or 30s when the DNR started transporting walleye into these inland lakes. Many of these lakes had been bass and bluegill lakes, northern, prior to that. But I'm curious since you get an opportunity to, for oral histories, what's the tribal perspective on where were walleyes historically? And I mean, does that come up as discussion?
Walleye definitely came up as a very popular topic to talk about. And there was recognition that ancestors used to spear walleye using birch bark torches and birch bark canoes and wooden spears in a lot of places. But I don't know that we have anything specific that would relate to, this lake was not a walleye lake until the DNR stocked it here. I'm not familiar with anything like that came out of any interviews.
Yeah, I'm not either. And unfortunately, our fisheries biologist isn't here either. He might have a lot more to add.
Hello, Hannah. My name's Carolyn Scholl. I am the Vilas County conservationist. In the next year or so, we are going to be rewriting our land and water management plans, or the plan for 2025 and beyond for 10 years. In these assessments, are there management recommendations that counties can refer to for those plans?
There aren't really. This is just looking at how climate change might impact some of these beings, and adaptation planning is our next step at GLIFWC, is using this information to think about what actions does GLIFWC as an organization want to take, and what actions can we recommend to our other co-managers. I think there's still a lot of good info in here that's really good for reframing your thinking in a lot of settings, but other than that, I don't know if there's a whole lot for you.
And the only other thing I would point out is that Ashland County recently redid their plan and had a series of climate change workshops to really incorporate climate change into their plan. So I'd encourage you to get in touch with them.
I don't see any other questions here. Rob and Hannah, again, just a big thank you for being with us here today. Hannah, have a great vacation. Thank you for being with us. Rob, really appreciate it. Let's give them one more round of applause, please, folks. Thank you to our Zoom participants. And usually we get this archive of this convention together within about 2 or 3 weeks. So give us a little time, but we will certainly share that with you down the road. So have a great afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for being a part of our session.